When we move into a new house, we expect fresh beginnings. But sometimes those walls hide secrets we can't imagine, secrets that wait for the perfect moment to make themselves known. Tonight, I'll share 5 chilling new house horror stories that will make you question every sound, every shadow, and every locked door. Let's begin. Jenna and Mike had been dreaming of owning their first home for years. When they finally closed on a charming 1950s Cape Cod, it felt like all their hard work had paid off. The house had character, arched doorways, a cozy fireplace, and a basement that Mike was excited to turn into a workshop. Best of all, the price was surprisingly low. Their friends teased them about buying a house so cheap, but Jenna and Mike laughed it off. They weren't superstitious, and the thought of anything strange didn't cross their minds. But some secrets, as they would soon learn, refused to stay hidden. The first few days were filled with unpacking and excitement. Mike claimed the basement as his domain, planning to set up his tools and storage. But while clearing out old junk left by the previous owners, he found a door tucked into the corner of the basement, a small, solid door with no visible handle. "Probably just a crawl space," Mike said, brushing it off. "Why is it locked then?" Jenna asked, frowning. Mike didn't have an answer, but they had bigger priorities at the time. They decided to ignore the door and focus on settling in. But Jenna couldn't shake the odd feeling she got whenever she went down to the basement. The air near the door was cold, colder than the rest of the room, even though the house had central heating. A week later, Jenna was folding laundry in the basement while Mike was at work. The hum of the dryer was soothing, and she almost didn't notice the faint scratching sound. At first, she thought it was a mouse. She turned off the dryer, and the scratching stopped. "Great," she muttered, imagining an infestation. But as soon as she resumed folding, the sound started again, this time louder. It was coming from behind the locked door. Jenna froze, her heart pounding. She stared at the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment, but nothing happened. She grabbed her laundry basket and bolted upstairs. When she told Mike that evening, he dismissed it. "Old houses make weird noises," he said. "It's probably just pipes or something." Jenna wasn't convinced, but she let it go. 2 nights later, Jenna woke to a loud bang. Mike was snoring beside her, undisturbed. She checked the time, 3:12 a.m. The noise had come from the basement. Grabbing her phone for light, Jenna crept downstairs. The basement door was ajar, even though she was sure they had closed it earlier. She hesitated, debating whether to wake Mike. But she convinced herself it was nothing and closed the door. The next morning, she found muddy footprints leading from the basement to the kitchen. "Mike," she hissed, shaking him awake. "Did you go downstairs last night?" He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "No. Why?" She pointed at the footprints. They were large, barefoot, and smeared across the tiles. Mike's face went pale. I didn't do that," he said. Determined to figure out what was going on, Mike borrowed a set of lockpicking tools from a co-worker. "This is ridiculous," Jenna muttered as he fiddled with the door. "What if it's just an empty closet?" "Then we'll know for sure," Mike replied, his brow furrowed. After several minutes, the lock clicked. Mike pushed the door open slowly. Inside was a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor was coated in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room sat an old rocking chair and a full-length mirror, its surface cracked and cloudy. "That's creepy," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. Mike shrugged, though he looked uneasy. "Probably just junk the previous owners left behind." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. After that night, the house didn't feel the same. Jenna started noticing odd things, lights flickering, cold drafts, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One afternoon, while cleaning the basement, she caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. It was quick, barely a second, but it froze her in place. It wasn't her reflection. It was a tall, dark figure standing behind her. Jenna spun around, but the room was empty. She ran upstairs, heart racing, and called Mike. "I'm not crazy," she insisted. "Something is down there." "Jenna, it's just your imagination," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But later that night, Mike experienced it himself. As he stood brushing his teeth, he saw movement in the mirror. It was the same dark figure, but this time it wasn't standing still. It was walking toward him. Desperate for answers, Jenna began researching the history of the house. She found an old article from the 1970s about a family that had lived there. The father, a carpenter, had renovated the basement himself, creating a special room that he claimed was a quiet space for his daughter. The daughter had disappeared shortly after. When Jenna showed the article to Mike, he finally agreed they needed to leave. But by then, the house had other plans. That night, they were jolted awake by a loud crash. The mirror from the locked room was in their bedroom, shattered into pieces. "We're leaving," Mike said, grabbing their keys. As they ran out the front door, Jenna glanced back. In the basement window, she saw the dark figure watching them, its hollow eyes gleaming in the moonlight. They never went back to the house. Months later, they learned that the new owners had torn it down, claiming it was beyond repair. But Jenna still dreams of the figure, standing in her room, its shadow stretching across the floor. What would you have done if you were in Jenna's shoes? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if this story gave you chills. Until next time, sleep with the lights on. Ben had always considered himself lucky when it came to finding great deals. A recent move to a new city meant starting over, and with a tight budget, he scoured Craigslist for furniture. When he found an ad for a free couch just a few blocks away, he jumped on the opportunity. The couch was described as well-loved but sturdy, and the owner was moving in a hurry. It seemed perfect. Ben had no idea that the couch came with a price no amount of money could ever cover. The meeting was uneventful. The owner, an older man with tired eyes, looked relieved when Ben arrived with a borrowed truck. "Take it," the man said quickly, barely making eye contact. Ben inspected the couch. It was a bit worn, with some frayed edges and a faint musty smell, but nothing he couldn't fix with a deep clean. "Thanks," Ben said cheerfully. The man hesitated, then added in a low voice, "You might want to keep it in the living room. Don't put it in your bedroom." Ben laughed, thinking it was a weird joke, but the man didn't smile. As he drove home, Ben thought about the man's odd behavior, but by the time he unloaded the couch and placed it in his apartment, the interaction was already fading from his mind. That evening, Ben plopped onto the couch with a beer, proud of his new setup. He spent hours scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing at the couch's worn fabric. It wasn't until he got up to turn off the lights that he noticed it. A faint, greasy handprint on the armrest. "That's weird," Ben muttered. He grabbed a rag and wiped it down, thinking it was leftover grime from the previous owner. That night, he slept soundly, but in the morning, he found the handprint again, this time on the cushion where he'd been sitting. A few nights later, Ben started having vivid nightmares. In the dreams, he was trapped in a pitch-black room, unable to move. He could hear muffled breathing and feel something cold brushing against his skin, but he couldn't see who or what was there. He woke up drenched in sweat, the dream still clinging to him like a second skin. The couch seemed different the next morning. Its smell was stronger, a damp, earthy scent that filled the room no matter how much air freshener Ben used. Still, he couldn't afford a new one, so he ignored it. Things started happening during the day. Ben would hear faint creaks coming from the couch, as though someone was sitting on it when he wasn't in the room. Objects placed near it, a remote, a book, his phone, would end up on the floor, as if pushed. One afternoon, Ben decided to vacuum under the cushions. As he lifted one, he froze. Tucked deep into the couch's folds was a small stained notebook. He opened it carefully, his heart racing. The first few pages were blank, but halfway through the writing began. Short, frantic sentences scrawled in black ink. "Don't sit too long. It watches when you sleep. Get rid of it before it's too late. Ben dropped the notebook, his hands shaking. That night, Ben stayed up late, determined to figure out what was happening. He sat across from the couch, his phone set to record. Hours passed, and nothing happened. He was about to give up when the cushions began to sink, slowly, deliberately, as though an invisible weight were pressing down. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The room felt colder, the air thick and heavy. He could barely move, paralyzed by fear. Then he saw it. A shadowy figure slumped on the couch, its shape faint but unmistakable. It didn't move, but Ben could feel its gaze. He grabbed his phone and bolted to his bedroom, locking the door behind him. The next day, Ben returned to Craigslist, hoping to find the original ad. He wanted answers. After hours of searching, he found it, but the contact information had been deleted. Desperate, he posted his own ad asking about the couch. A few hours later, he received a reply. The message was simple: "You need to get rid of it. It's cursed. Don't let it stay in your home." Ben tried replying, but the account had already been deleted. That evening, Ben dragged the couch to the curb, ignoring the strange looks from his neighbors. He thought it was over, but when he woke the next morning, the couch was back in his living room. It sat there, as though it had never left, its smell stronger than ever. Ben's stomach churned as he noticed the greasy handprints. There were more now, smudged across the back and arms. Ben decided to end it once and for all. He called a friend who owned a truck and asked for help dumping the couch at the landfill. That night, as he waited for his friend, he felt an overwhelming urge to sit on the couch. He fought it at first, pacing the room, but the pull was irresistible. The moment he sat down, the lights flickered and the air grew icy. He tried to stand, but he couldn't move. The room seemed to warp around him, the walls closing in. From the corner of his eye, he saw it. The shadowy figure was back, and this time it wasn't staying still. It leaned closer, its shape growing more defined. Ben's scream was cut short as the world went black. When Ben's friend arrived, the apartment was empty. The couch was gone, and so was Ben. The only sign he had ever been there was the stained notebook, left open on the coffee table. The last entry, written in shaky handwriting, read, "Don't take the couch, don't let it take you." Some bargains aren't worth the price. What would you have done if you were in Ben's place? Let me know in the comments. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, be careful what you bring into your home. It might not want to leave. Emily and her husband Dave had been searching for the perfect home for months. When they stumbled upon a quaint two-story house tucked away on a quiet street, it seemed too good to be true. The house was charming and full of potential. Sure, it needed some cosmetic work, but Emily loved its vintage character. The seller had one strange request. Under no circumstances were they to open the locked door on the second floor. The explanation was vague, something about old plumbing and structural damage, but the seller was adamant. Emily and Dave shrugged it off. After all, every house had its quirks. What they didn't realize was that some doors are locked for a reason. Moving day was a whirlwind of unpacking and arranging furniture. Emily noticed the locked door almost immediately. It was at the end of the upstairs hallway, its dark wood scuffed and its brass knob slightly tarnished. She felt a strange unease whenever she passed it. Dave, ever the pragmatist, dismissed her concerns. "It's probably just storage. We'll get around to dealing with it later," he said. But Emily couldn't help wondering what was inside. One night, as Emily was brushing her teeth, she noticed something odd. Faint, jagged scratches near the bottom of the locked door. They were small, as if made by fingernails. "Dave, did you see these?" she called out. He glanced over and frowned. Maybe the previous owner had a dog. Emily nodded, but the explanation didn't sit right. The scratches weren't in a random pattern. They were concentrated around the keyhole, like someone had been desperately trying to open it from the other side. A week after moving in, Emily was alone in the house. Dave had gone to work, and she was busy unpacking boxes in the living room. Around midday, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. She froze, listening. The sound was coming from upstairs, from the locked room. Her heart pounded as she crept up the stairs. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. She stood in front of the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. "Hello?" she whispered. The tapping stopped. When Dave came home, Emily told him what had happened. "You're just stressed," he said, pulling her into a hug. "Old houses make weird noises. It's probably just pipes or something." Emily wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just pipes. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but her unease grew with each passing minute. Then, just as she was beginning to drift off, she heard it again. The tapping. Emily decided to investigate. Armed with her phone flashlight, she tiptoed down the hallway. The tapping was louder now, almost insistent. When she reached the door, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A faint shadow moving back and forth under the door. "Dave!" she screamed, running back to the bedroom. Dave groggily followed her into the hallway, but when they reached the door, the shadow was gone and the tapping had stopped. "I didn't see anything," Dave said, yawning. "You're probably imagining things." Emily didn't argue, but she knew what she had seen. The next day, Emily decided to do some digging. She went through the attic, hoping to find clues about the house's history. In a dusty corner, she found an old wooden trunk. Inside was a faded leather journal. The entries were written in an elegant, old-fashioned script. One entry, dated nearly 50 years ago, caught her attention. "The room is locked again. I hear her at night, crying and scratching. I tried to help, but she doesn't want to leave. She doesn't belong anywhere else." Emily's hands shook as she closed the journal. Who was she? That night, Emily decided she couldn't take it anymore. "I'm opening it," she said firmly. Dave sighed. "It's probably just a broom closet, Em. But fine, let's get it over with." They retrieved a toolbox, and after a few minutes of fiddling with the lock, the door creaked open. The room was small and empty, except for a single rocking chair in the corner. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges. But what caught their attention were the drawings. Childish crayon drawings covered the walls, depicting a girl with wide, hollow eyes. In some of the drawings, she was crying. In others, she was surrounded by dark, clawed figures. "What the hell?" Dave whispered. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Emily and Dave tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew cold, and the faint sound of crying filled the room. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Dave nodded, his face pale. The crying grew louder, turning into a wail. The rocking chair began to move on its own, creaking back and forth. Then they saw her. The girl from the drawings stood in the corner, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as she reached for them. Emily screamed as Dave threw his weight against the door. After what felt like an eternity, it burst open, and they stumbled into the hallway. They didn't look back. They grabbed their keys and fled the house, leaving the door wide open. The next day, they called the seller, demanding answers. The seller's voice was cold. "I told you not to open it," she said. "You've let her out now. She'll follow you." Emily and Dave moved out within a week, abandoning most of their belongings. But even in their new apartment, Emily feels the presence. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she hears the faint sound of a rocking chair. Some doors are locked for a reason. Would you have opened it? Let me know in the comments. And if this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, keep an eye on the shadows, and never ignore the scratches on a locked door. Chelsea had never considered herself superstitious. She was practical, level-headed, and not easily scared. When her company asked her to relocate temporarily for a work project, she saw it as an adventure. Instead of booking a hotel, she opted for a cozy Airbnb, a charming older house with character. The listing was perfect, affordable, highly rated, and close to her new office. The host, Anne, was polite but brief in their messages. Everything seemed normal, at least at first. Chelsea didn't know that some places come with more than just furniture. Chelsea arrived in the late afternoon, suitcase in hand. The house was just as described in the listing, quaint and welcoming, with antique furniture and a warm atmosphere. She noted the creaky wooden floors and vintage decor, thinking they added charm. Anne wasn't there to greet her, but left a note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome, Chelsea. Enjoy your stay. Let me know if you need anything. P.S. The attic is off limits." Chelsea found it odd, but shrugged it off. Most old houses had quirky rules. Her first night was uneventful. She fell asleep easily, exhausted from the move, and woke up the next morning feeling refreshed. The trouble began on her second night. Around 2 a.m., Chelsea woke to a strange sound. Faint footsteps above her room, her eyes shot open, heart racing. She lay still, listening. The footsteps were deliberate, pacing back and forth. She thought about Anne's note. The attic is off limits. Chelsea grabbed her phone and texted Anne. "Hi, is there anyone else staying here? I'm hearing footsteps in the attic." Anne didn't respond. The noise continued for another hour before stopping abruptly. Chelsea barely slept after that. The next morning, Chelsea received a reply from Anne. "No one else is staying there. The house is old. It's probably just settling." Chelsea wasn't convinced. The footsteps had been too distinct, too human. But Anne's casual tone made her second-guess herself. That evening, Chelsea decided to investigate. She stood at the base of the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The door at the top was locked, just as Anne had promised. She pressed her ear to the door. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, soft, deliberate tapping. Chelsea stumbled back, heart pounding. The third night was worse. Chelsea went to bed with every light in the house on, hoping it would help her sleep. But just as she was drifting off, the whispering began. It wasn't words, exactly. More like a low, indistinct murmur. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Clutching her phone, Chelsea tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind? Old pipes? But deep down, she knew better. She texted Anne again. "The noise is getting worse. Are you sure there's no one else here?" This time, Anne didn't respond at all. On the fourth night, Chelsea made a decision. She couldn't take it anymore. She climbed the stairs to the attic, armed with a flashlight. The door was still locked, but she noticed something strange. Faint scratches around the keyhole. As she stood there, debating what to do, the scratching sound began again, this time from the other side of the door. Chelsea froze. The noise grew louder, more frantic, and suddenly the door creaked open a few inches. Her flashlight beam illuminated a sliver of the attic. Dust motes floated in the air, and she could just make out old furniture and boxes piled high. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Chelsea screamed and ran back to her room. The next morning, Chelsea demanded answers. She called Anne repeatedly until she finally picked up. "There's something wrong with this house," Chelsea said, her voice shaking. "You need to come here." Anne sighed. "I'll be there tonight." When Anne arrived, she looked pale and nervous. She wouldn't make eye contact with Chelsea as she explained. "The house has a history," she began. "The attic used to be a maid's quarters decades ago. She didn't leave under good circumstances." Chelsea's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" Anne hesitated. "She disappeared. Some say she ran away, but others, they think she's still here." Chelsea stared at her in disbelief. "And you didn't think to mention this?" "I thought it was just stories," Anne said defensively. "I've never experienced anything myself." But the look on Anne's face suggested otherwise. That evening, Anne offered to stay with Chelsea. They sat in the living room, trying to ignore the oppressive silence. Around midnight, the noises began again. Footsteps above, faint whispers, and then the unmistakable sound of furniture scraping across the attic floor. "Do you hear that?" Chelsea asked, her voice barely a whisper. Anne nodded, her face pale. "She's restless tonight." Suddenly, the attic door slammed open. Both women jumped to their feet as heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs. "Run!" Anne shouted. They bolted out of the house, not stopping until they reached Anne's car. Chelsea refused to return to the house. She booked a hotel for the remainder of her stay, but the experience haunted her. Anne later admitted she had always felt uneasy about the attic. "I should have warned you," she said. "I thought if I ignored it, nothing would happen." Chelsea cut all contact after that. She never found out what or who was in the attic, but she swore she would never stay in an Airbnb again. Some places hold on to their past, no matter how much we try to forget. Would you have stayed after hearing those noises? Let me know in the comments. And if this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, think twice before opening a door that isn't meant for you. Carlos and Mia had been searching for months to find their dream home. When they finally moved into a newly built house in a quiet suburb, it seemed like everything was falling into place. There were no previous owners, no history to the house, just a blank slate for their future. They loved the clean lines of the architecture and the large bedroom with its floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the backyard, but from the very first night, Mia felt off. "I don't know," she said as they unpacked boxes. "It's like the house is too quiet." Carlos laughed. "That's the whole point. No noisy neighbors, no creaky floors. It's perfect." Mia nodded, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Their first night in the house, Mia woke up suddenly. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. She glanced at the clock, 3:13 a.m. At first, she wasn't sure what had woken her. Then she saw it. In the faint light, a shadowy figure stood outside the window. It was tall and motionless, blending into the darkness. Mia froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure, unable to move. "Carlos," she whispered, nudging her husband. Carlos groaned and rolled over. "What is it?" "There's someone outside." Carlos sat up, squinting at the window. "I don't see anything." The shadow was gone. The next morning, Mia felt silly. "It was probably just my imagination," she told Carlos. But deep down, she wasn't convinced. That evening, as they settled in to watch TV, Mia noticed something strange. The large living room window that faced the backyard had smudges, like handprints, but distorted, as if someone had dragged their fingers across the glass. "Did you see this?" she asked Carlos. He frowned. "Probably the movers. I'll clean it later." But when he tried to wipe the smudges away, they didn't budge. A few nights later, Carlos woke up to a strange sound, like someone walking through gravel. He glanced at Mia, still asleep beside him, and quietly got out of bed. He grabbed a flashlight and headed to the backyard. The sound stopped as soon as he stepped outside. The yard was empty, the night air still. Carlos scanned the area, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. Just as he was about to go back inside, the beam of his flashlight landed on something in the grass. Footprints. Bare, human footprints, leading from the fence to the house. Carlos followed the trail, but it stopped abruptly near the bedroom window. Mia's unease turned to dread when the shadow appeared again. This time, she saw it standing in the corner of the bedroom, near the window. It was taller than any human, its outline distorted as though it didn't belong in this world. "Carlos," she whispered, shaking him awake. Carlos sat up, and the shadow disappeared. "It's not there," he said, his voice groggy but firm. "You're just stressed from the move." But Mia knew what she had seen. A week later, Carlos began acting strangely. Mia woke one night to find his side of the bed empty. She got up, calling his name, and found him standing in the living room, staring out the window. "Carlos?" He turned slowly, his eyes unfocused. "She's here," he said, his voice flat and cold. Mia's blood ran cold. "Who's here?" But Carlos didn't answer. He simply walked back to bed and lay down as if nothing had happened. The next morning, he had no memory of it. The activity in the house escalated. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and the shadow appeared more frequently. One night, Mia woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from the window. She sat up, clutching the blankets, and saw the shadow again, inside the room this time, its dark form looming over the bed. "Get out!" she screamed. Carlos woke to see Mia sobbing, pointing at the empty space near the window. "It was right there," she insisted. Carlos finally admitted he had seen things too. The footprints, the smudges on the window, and the shadow outside. "We need to get help," he said. Desperate, they called a local priest to bless the house. The priest arrived the next day, carrying a small bottle of holy water and a Bible. As he began the blessing, the house grew colder. The lights flickered violently, and the priest's voice trembled as he recited the prayers. When he reached the bedroom, the priest froze. "Did you open this house to anything?" he asked, his voice sharp. "What do you mean?" Mia asked. "Anything that doesn't belong. Something from the other side." Carlos and Mia shook their heads, confused. The priest sprinkled holy water around the room and prayed louder. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, and the shadow appeared one last time, its form writhing as though it were in pain. Then it was gone. For a while, things seemed to return to normal, but Mia couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow wasn't gone for good. A month later, she woke up in the middle of the night to find Carlos standing by the window again, staring into the darkness. "Mia," he said, his voice hollow. "She's back." Not all new beginnings are as clean as they seem. What would you have done in Mia and Carlos's situation? Let me know in the comments. And if this story kept you on edge, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, be mindful of what watches from the shadows. Thank you for watching. If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have your own creepy story to share, email it to me in the description. Who knows, it might just make it into the next video. Until next time, sleep tight.